Okay, good morning and welcome to today's Coroners Court webinar. My name's Charlie Lay. I'm one of the tissue viability nurse specialists for Coloplast, and I've got with me my colleague Sam Wharton. Sam is going to man the chat today, so if you've got any questions throughout, please do put them in the chat. There will be times that I ask you to put answers in the chat as well, and at the end, if you'd like to come on camera and we can release your microphone, then you're very welcome to come on and share what your thoughts are. This is quite an interactive session, and I appreciate that's not always easy to do over Teams and on a webinar, but please do use the chat function as we go through today's session. So we're going to start off with the importance of your documentation, and hopefully that will make your life a little bit easier in your workplace. And then we will go on to the Coroners Court. And the Coroners Court is split into 5 short videos, and in between each video clip, we will have a discussion. So that is when I will ask you to put some things in the chat. Sam and I will also have a bit of a discussion around what we've seen. And yeah, please feel free to share your thoughts. So let's get started. So it's Stop the Pressure Week, Stop the Pressure Day actually today. So today's Coroners Court is all about pressure ulcers, and we need to start by understanding what a pressure ulcer is. So a pressure ulcer is a localized damage to the skin and the underlying soft tissues. The injury is usually over a bony prominence, and I say usually because it can also be related to a medical or other device. So if your patient has been laying on their television remote for the whole night, it could be the television remote that has caused that pressure damage. They can be present as intact skin or as an open wound. So your category 1 would be your intact skin. Your category 2 clear fluid-filled blister would also be intact skin. And then anything that has open skin is obviously an open wound. They can be extremely painful, and what you often find is patients with the category 1 and 2s are more painful than those that are 3 and 4. They occur as a result of that intense or prolonged pressure, but can be also in combination with shearing. There is a massive impact of pressure ulcers in the UK. We have over 1,300 new pressure ulcers that are reported every month, and those are just the ones that are reported. And I suspect that actually that number is probably higher than that, because there will be people that are trying to manage their own pressure ulcers at home that no healthcare professional knows about. They affect over 200,000 people annually in the UK, and they are the single most costly chronic wound to the NHS, accounting for up to 4% of the UK healthcare budget, which is around £2.1 billion per year. That is a phenomenal amount of money that we are spending on something that we can prevent from happening. Now, pressure ulcers in older patients are associated with a 5-fold increase in mortality, and in-hospital mortality in this group is 25 to 33%. So they aren't going to pass away just because of their wound, but the likelihood is that they will get sepsis from their wound, and that's what will cause ultimately for them to lose their life. We can prevent pressure ulcers. There is lots of prevention that we can put in place to prevent people from this damage occurring to the skin. And if we can prevent them, then we can reduce the cost to the NHS. We can reduce caseloads for you guys that are working out in the community, that are having to see people with pressure ulcers, those of you that are working in nursing and care homes. But ultimately, we can try and prevent people from passing away because of their wound. Now, towards the end of last year, the National Wound Care Strategy Programme released their pressure ulcer clinical recommendations and their clinical pathway. Now, not everywhere has adopted these recommendations. They are only recommendations. It doesn't mean that NHS trusts or care homes have to adopt these recommendations, but what they have suggested is that we now categorise pressure ulcers using categories 1 to 4. So we used to have categories 1 to 4. We also had unstageable and we had deep tissue injury. Unstageable now will sit under a category 3 until the devitalized tissue, so the slough or the necrosis that is in that wound, is removed, and then you can recategorize it if you are able to see structures underneath such as bone, tendon, etc. Then that would then become a category 4. Deep tissue injury is no longer a category. I know some trusts are keeping it as a category 1. Some trusts have kept it as it's a category on its own. What you must do is follow whatever your policies are in your trust or in your care home, because, as I say, not everywhere has adopted these recommendations. So this is just highlighting the two pictures that are in orange. The unstageable and the deep tissue injury are the two categories that have now been removed, and your unstageable will sit in your category 3 area if you are following the new guidance from the National Wound Care Strategy Programme. Now, this information on this slide has been taken from the NHS resolution. An NHS resolution is the Department of Health body that provides the indemnity to the NHS for the risks involved in delivering healthcare services. So, to put it in layman's terms, the NHS resolution pays out money as compensation, if you like, for patients that haven't received the care that they should have received. Now, that's not to say they haven't received the care. Generally, what happens is that care hasn't been documented, and therefore, if it's not written down, then it hasn't happened. Now, in 2021 and 2022, the total payments from the NHS resolution were £2.4 billion. So it's costing us £2.1 billion to look after patients with pressure ulcers, and it's also costing £2.4 billion to pay out compensation for the risks involved in delivering healthcare services. The total NHS budget was 199 billion. So you might think, oh, well, 2.4 billion of 199 isn't a lot, but we're talking about billions of pounds here. It is a lot. It's an awful lot of money. So between 2010 and 11 and 2019 and 2020, the NHS resolution were notified of nearly 1,800 claims relating to hospital-acquired pressure ulcers. And of those, the NHS resolution settled just 15 of those at a cost of £300,000. So that's just 15 that they've settled. Imagine how much money that's going to cost if they settle all 1,781 of those claims. It's going to be a phenomenal amount of money. So I'm going to talk you through this case study, and this has come from the NHS resolution. They have lots of illustrative case studies on there, and this is particularly about a patient that developed pressure ulcers. So this was an elderly gentleman that lived in a care home. He was very frail and he had a fall. He was taken into hospital via ambulance and he was triaged in A&E or ED, whichever you like to call it. And the triage decided that he actually needed to be seen within 60 minutes. 6 hours later, this gentleman was finally seen and assessed. They decided to admit this gentleman for social reasons, but there was no beds available in the hospital. He spent 16 hours and 45 minutes on an ED trolley. He had a Waterloo score done and was deemed to be high risk of developing pressure ulcers. They did put him on a Biflex mattress, but his pressure areas were never checked. This gentleman wasn't incontinent, but became incontinent whilst in ED because he wasn't provided regular toileting. The staff weren't able to get to him when he was asking to go. And unfortunately, this gentleman got 4 pressure ulcers, 2 to his sacrum and 2 to his heels. Now, there was failure in care here for this gentleman to undertake a skin assessment of a high-risk patient and document it accordingly on a body map. Now, I know people will be saying, well, some patients don't want to have their skin checked, and that is absolutely fine. It's the patient's choice, and if they decline to have their skin checked, that isn't a problem, but it needs to be documented, and that conversation needs to be repeated. You don't ask once and never ask again. You have to continually have that conversation about why you need to check that patient's skin and the reasons that you need to check their skin. And if the patient understands why you're doing what you're doing, they're more likely to comply with what you are asking. There were significant gaps in this gentleman's nursing documentation. They didn't perform regular nutrition reviews during his time in ED. They didn't perform 2-hourly care and comfort rounds whilst he was in ED, and he was not adequately repositioned on the trolley. Now, this gentleman was awarded compensation due to the gaps in his care in repositioning, the inadequate comfort rounds, the irregular nutrition and hydration, and the lack of a skin inspection. So there is a massive impact on pressure ulcers on the patient. Not only can they lead to severe disabilities such as amputation, but they often require extended hospital stays. They can result in infection. So we talked already, haven't we, about a wound causing sepsis, but they can also cause osteomyelitis, and osteomyelitis is that infection in the bone. It's very, excuse me, very difficult to treat and can be extremely painful for the patient. Pressure ulcers can become life-threatening if the patient develops sepsis, and unfortunately can result in the need for surgery or prolonged periods of forced immobility. Now, nursing has changed a lot over the years, as I'm sure you're all aware. And when I first started nursing, generally, the majority of our patients were elderly patients, sort of, I would say, 70 years and above, particularly patients with pressure ulcers. However, patients are becoming much younger. They have got far more complex comorbidities and multiple comorbidities. And if you think about our younger generation of patients that may still be of working age, let's take a patient that perhaps is paralysed from the waist down and needs to use a wheelchair on a daily basis. They're still able to go to work, but they then develop a pressure ulcer on their ischial tuberosity, so their seat bones on their bottom. And what we decide as the healthcare professionals is actually we need to probably nurse you in bed to be able to keep that patient off their bottom for a good amount of time, so they're not going to be able to get out into their wheelchair on a daily basis. Now, if that patient can't get out into their wheelchair, it means they can't go to work, and if they don't go to work, they either don't get paid or they get a very reduced pay from the government. And that then has a knock-on effect, because if that person then has a family and a house and a mortgage, that's going to make things very difficult for them to be able to pay their bills, to be able to feed their family, to be able to pay their mortgage. So there is a lot to think about. Not only does, a patient may develop a pressure ulcer, but the ongoing problems that may occur from that also. And we need to think about that patient holistically and not just that wound in isolation. Now, this is the Patient Safety Incident Reporting Framework, PSIRF for short, and I'm going to refer to it as PSIRF. And this is a relatively new framework that is being adopted by the NHS. Some NHS trusts have already adopted it, some are in the process of doing so, and some will be doing so in the future. And this is, as it says in the title, relates to patient safety incidents. And this is more of a holistic framework, if you like, to managing patient safety incidents. It's more of a compassionate engagement, and it involves those that have been affected by the incident. So it will involve the patient, it will involve the members of staff that have been looking after that patient, it may involve the family if the patient is happy for the family to be involved. In times gone by, generally with patient safety incidents relating to wounds, this would be something that was investigated wholly by the tissue viability team. But actually this is around learning. This isn't about apportioning blame, it's about What have we done here that hasn't worked well? What can we learn from it? And how can we do better in the future? And really, the people that have been involved in that situation are the best people to have a look at what has gone on within that patient safety incident and investigate it themselves, because you learn more that way. You can pick out and highlight what didn't work particularly well, and then as a team you can come together and decide what's going to work best for the future. There'll be an application of a range of system-based approach to the learning from the patient safety incidents, but it will also help you to consider a proportionate response to the patient safety incidents, to the families, to the patient and the carers that have also been involved. It gives that supportive oversight that's focused on strengthening the response system and function and improving what we are doing. It's not an investigation framework as such, because it advocates a coordinated and data-driven approach to patient safety incidents. It's more of a holistic framework, and actually I personally feel that this is the way to go, and this is being adopted by NHS trusts if it hasn't been adopted already. Now, we're talking about documentation and some of the possible consequences of not ensuring that you have good documentation. Now, coroners courts are not always going to be for patients that you have nursed in the last few weeks. You could be called to a coroner's court for a patient that you may have looked after 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't remember what I did yesterday. So trying to remember what I did for Mrs. Smith 3 years ago is going to be near on impossible. So you will rely heavily on your documentation for that. And if your documentation isn't clear, you haven't been concise with it, it's going to be very difficult for you to recall. So some of the consequences of poor documentation could be internal. So you could be called to a disciplinary or a capability hearing within your trust. You could, if it goes further, be called into the NMC for a fitness to practice. You could be called to coroner's court, but you could also be called to a magistrates or a Crown Court. And that's not anywhere that any of us want to end up. Okay, because magistrates and Crown Court come with prison sentences, and you don't want to have a prison sentence because your documentation hasn't fully explained what you actually did for that patient. You could end up with a civil claim of negligence against you, so you could be sued. There could be a public inquiry. So these are all possible consequences that you could face just resulting in poor documentation. So our accountability, who's accountable? Well, we all are. As professionals, we are all personally accountable for the actions and the omissions in our practice. And omissions are absolutely fine if you document them and give a rationale as to why that omission has taken place. You need to make sure that you document and give a rationale for any actions or any omissions that you take. We as nurses make judgments in a wide variety of circumstances, and we use our professional knowledge and skills all the time to make decisions based on the evidence, based on best practice, and ultimately in that person's best interests. But you've got to be able to document the reason as to why. Your documentation is not only there to support your patient, but it's also there to support you and to protect you. And that is why it is so important. Documentation isn't a nice to do. It's something you have got to do. And time constraints, lack of staffing, these are not genuine reasons not to complete your documentation. If you have problems with staffing, if you have problems with the skill mix, there's not, the correct skill mix within your team, then these things need to be reported. Now in the NHS, that will be via the DATEC system. In care homes, I know you have different systems to be able to report on, but you must make these reports. And I know people, I can see you all rolling your eyes and thinking, oh, she's on her high horse today. Yes, I am. But if you don't report, nothing will change. And every datex, every report that you put in has to be reviewed. So I was a tissue viability nurse specialist in an acute setting, so in a hospital. Every datex that came through about a wound, most of which were pressure ulcers, I have to admit, I had to review every single one of them. And most of the time, I also went down and reviewed the majority, I would say probably 90% of those patients and their pressure ulcers also. So every datex you put in has to be reviewed by somebody. And the more that go in about the lack of staff, the lack of time, the more something will have to be done about it eventually. And I'm not going to say if you put 10 datexes in within a week, you're going to get 10 more staff on the ward, because we know that's not going to happen. But eventually something will have to happen. So make sure you're reporting it. We have a professional duty of candour. Now, it's vital that health and care professionals understand their responsibility to be open and honest with the people that use our services, our employers, and also with the NMC. Now, I remember when professional duty of candour came about, and there was a real fear of apologising when something went wrong, because people felt that that opened us up to litigation. However, why should we not apologise? We need to be open and honest with our patients, with the people that use our services. And if something hasn't gone well, we should apologise for it. Okay. This code, the professional duty of candour, and the guidance help nurses and midwifery professionals to understand and apply the duty of candour. It helps ensure that people who use our services receive the care they deserve and have the right to expect. And if they don't, then we need to apologise for that. So you can have a look at the openness and honesty when things go wrong, the professional duty of candour on the NMC website, and it gives you lots of information on there about it. But we must be open and honest with our patients. Now, the role of the coroner. So it's the coroner's jurisdiction, which is limited to determining who the deceased was, how, why, and when they came by their death. When the death is suspected to have been either sudden, with an unknown cause, violent or unnatural, the coroner decides whether to hold a post-mortem examination and, if necessary, an inquest. So a personal story, my father-in-law sadly passed away a couple of years ago now, and it was an unexpected death. So my father did have a post-mortem examination to determine his cause of death, which were found to be natural causes, and therefore it didn't need to go to a further inquest. But had they found unnatural causes for my father-in-law's death, that would have then gone on to an inquest with the coroner. Okay. So there are two types of inquests. There is a pre-inquest hearing, and this is generally when a full inquest can't be held within days of the death. The coroner will open the inquest at a short hearing called a pre-inquest review hearing. Now, generally, the pre-inquest hearings are only attended by the coroner and his or her staff. There may be solicitors that attend that as well, but the coroner will decide how long the inquest is likely to last, whether a jury will be needed, and whether any other hearings are needed. And then we have the coroner's inquest, and this is the legal inquiry into a death, which is held when the cause is unknown, violent, or unnatural. Now, coroners' courts are held in public, so anybody can go and sit in the gallery and listen to a coroner's inquest, and the coroner will then determine the cause of death and is usually held without a jury. That's not to say that a jury won't be called, but the majority don't need a jury in a coroner's inquest. There is also, if you look on your local sort of council's websites, you can look to see when coroner's inquests are taking place, so you can go and sit in and listen. And you can also look at previous inquests, look at the outcomes, and then look at whether any Regulation 28s, which I will explain to you shortly, were needed, and then the response from any of the parties that had a Regulation 28 put against them. So if you were called to a coroner's inquest You will have legal representation. Your trust or care home will have legal teams that will support you through this process. They will give you advice on what you can and can't say. But it is your duty to the court and the coroner, and they will expect you to answer their questions as accurately as possible. And remember that it is under oath. And this is where your documentation will come in hand, because you won't be able to remember everything that happened. So you will rely heavily on your documentation if you were called to a coroner's inquest. It's not there to apportion blame, and your records will be invaluable to support you in answering the coroner's questions. You should only state the facts when given evidence. Don't add anything to the story. Don't make anything up. Just stick to the facts. If you don't know the answer, it's absolutely fine to say that you don't know. Do not lie. Do not add anything to the story, and do not make anything up. Because remember, this is a court of law and you are under oath. So stick to the facts, stick to what the documentation says, and answer the questions to your best of your ability from the notes that you have from the documentation. So there are numerous findings of facts or verdicts or conclusions, as coroners like to actually call them. There is natural causes, so this is the normal development of a natural illness. It's not significantly contributed to by human intervention. You have accidental death or misadventure. So this is the cause of death was unnatural, but it wasn't unlawful. So the deceased has taken a deliberate action that has resulted in their death. So one of the easier ways to describe this is back in the 90s, when teenagers, people in their early 20s, were going over to places like Ibiza and taking all sorts of different recreational drugs, some of which made these people feel like they were able to fly. And so unfortunately, we had a string of people passing away because they were jumping off their balconies in their hotels thinking that they were able to fly. Now, obviously, they weren't able to fly, and they were sadly falling to their deaths. Now, this would be a death by misadventure, because they didn't mean to kill themselves, but they did take a deliberate action that resulted in their death. There is unlawful killing, so this is your murder, your manslaughter, your infanticide, and serious driving offences. There is suicide, so this is when the deceased voluntarily acts to end their own life in a conscious way. There is neglect, so this is a gross failure to provide the deceased with their basic needs. And then you have a narrative conclusion, and this is where the coroner sets out the circumstances of the death in a detailed way based on the evidence heard. And a narrative conclusion is likely because it doesn't fit into any of these other categories perfectly, if you like. So the coroner sets out the circumstances in a narrative conclusion. And then you have a Regulation 28. Now, a Regulation 28 happens when the coroner has heard evidence that further avoidable deaths could happen if preventative action is not taken. Now, NHS trusts, companies do not want a Regulation 28 because it's like a big flashing beacon to say that avoidable deaths have taken place here. So throughout a coroner's investigation, what you will find is the NHS trusts or the companies, the institutions, will try and find ways to negate having a Regulation 28 applied to them. Now, if the coroner feels that a Regulation 28 is deemed appropriate, that report is sent to the person or the authority who have the power to make the changes that are suggested within that trust or within that company. And they then have 56 days to respond, to show how they have made those changes according to the coroner's recommendation, or how they intend to. And what you will often find in coroner's court is that the trust or the company are able to say how they've already put things in place to prevent this from happening again. And you may see this later on when we actually go through the coroner's court. So your record keeping, your documentation, the age-old saying, if it hasn't been written down, then it hasn't been done. And you will have heard this, those of you that are qualified registered nurses, from the minute you start your nurse training, you will hear it throughout your nurse training, and you will hear it throughout your career as a nurse. It's part of clinical governance and your documentation, and it is an integral part of nursing, midwifery, and allied health professionals practice. It is absolutely essential to keeping both your patients and yourself safe. And as I said earlier, it's not a nice to do. It's not an optional extra. You have to do your record keeping. The best time to do it is as soon as you have done something with that patient. I appreciate that is not always possible, particularly for those of you that work out in the community and you have no signal for your system. But what I would recommend in that instance is that you do keep notes that you can then shred at the end of the day when you have uploaded your notes onto your computer. But it is vital that you make sure you do your record keeping and your documentation. Now, records can include anything that makes reference to the care of the patient, and any record can be used as evidence or called as evidence as part of a serious investigation. It can be part of a trust disciplinary hearing or part of a coroner's inquest. So any documentation that you make can be called as evidence. And that applies to all form of record keeping. Now, we have less and less paper records now because we have so many electronic systems that we can document our records on. But one of the things in this list that often doesn't get documented particularly well is telephone conversations. And often what you will see written in notes is telephone conversation with consultant or GP. Well, that's great, but what was that conversation actually about? You know, the GP could have been telling you about the holiday that they've just been on, or the consultant could be. So you need to you need to actually document what that conversation was about, who you had it with, not just consultant or GP, what the person's name is, and what you discussed about that patient. You need to ensure that photography of wounds is uploaded to your systems, or if you are in an acute trust and you have a photography department, that they come down and take the photos and attach them to the patient's record. You need to ensure that your wound and your risk assessments forms are completed and completed in a timely manner. Don't just document that you've completed the wound care. Say what you've actually done for that wound. What was the dressing like that you took off? What was it able to manage the exudate coming from that wound? What colour was the exudate that came from that wound? How thick was the exudate? Was it thin and serous fluid, or was it thick and purulent? Did it smell? What does the wound look like? Look at your wound bed, your wound edge, and your peri-wound skin and explain what you can see. Also explain what the surrounding skin looks like. Is that surrounding skin healthy? If the surrounding skin isn't healthy, it's going to make it much more difficult to be able to heal that wound. Then what did you do for that wound? Did you cleanse and debride that wound using a debridement pad, such as All-Prep pad? How did you treat that wound? Make sure all of that is documented. So the next person that then is looking at that patient and their wound can see what was done previously and can see whether any changes need to be made to that care plan, or they can continue that care plan. So make sure all these forms of your records are well documented. As I said, if it's not recorded, then it didn't happen. And your records may assist you in defending claims of negligence. Your records will be called to Coroners Court investigations. They can be called internally within your trust. So make sure that you are documenting and documented well. You don't need to write war and peace about your patients. You can bullet point it, but you need to write the things that are important. So it's vital that you do your documentation. Common problems that myself and my colleagues within our tissue viability nurse specialist team within Coloplast have seen throughout our careers as tissue viability nurses is an absence of clarity, failure to record action taken when a problem has been identified, failure to escalate, and that is something that we see all the time. A problem has occurred, but there's no documentation of any escalation. So if you find a patient has developed a pressure ulcer, what are you going to do about that? You need to be able to order them equipment, don't you? When did you order that equipment? What equipment did you order? When are you expecting it? If that equipment doesn't arrive, what have you done about it? You need to escalate that. Okay. Missing information and inaccurate wound measurements. Do not approximate your wound measurements. In the dressing packs, I think the majority of dressing packs have the little paper rulers. Make sure you measure that wound accurately, because your approximation and somebody else's approximation could be very different. You could approximate that that wound is actually, what, 3 by 5 centimetres, but when it's measured accurately, it could actually be 5 by 8 centimetres. So it's really important that you accurately measure so that the next person that is seeing that patient and reviewing their wound doesn't think, oh my gosh, this wound has got so much bigger within the last week. You need to be accurate with your documentation. Examples of common issues found in patients' records, and a huge bugbear of mine, but I will be honest, and it is terminology that I have used myself in the past: leaking plus, or plus plus plus. What does that actually mean? What does plus 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 mean? Well, what it means for you might be different to what it means for me. It's very subjective, so make sure you write low, moderate, or high exudate, and that still can be very subjective, but also write what it is you're seeing with that exudate along with low, moderate, and high. Is it clear fluid that is coming from that wound? Is it thick, purulent pus that is coming from that wound? Is it bloody? All of these things can give you so much more information than just leaking. Skin intact. That's great. Is that across the whole body, or is that in a particular place? So you need to be specific about that. Skin intact doesn't really tell us anything unless you specify where it is. All care given. Guilty. I've written this in the past, and I'm sure all of my colleagues have at some point in their nursing careers, as I'm sure all of you have. But what does all care given mean? Does it mean that you have given the care on all of the care plans that that patient has, or have you just given care for one of those care plans? So be specific about what you mean about all care given. Mattress ordered, brilliant, but what mattress is it? When was it ordered? What date? When are you expecting the delivery? And patient repositioned. That's brilliant that the patient is being repositioned, but where are they repositioned to? Are they levitating in the air, which would be great for all of our patients that have pressure ulcers? However, we can't get our patients to levitate. So where have they been repositioned to? Are they repositioned onto their left side, on their right side? Have they been sat out in the chair? Do you need to use cushions or wedges to be able to reposition that patient? So be more specific about what it is that you've done. Add 3 little words, and 3 little words can make the world of difference. If you look at the first one, sacral area red, that doesn't tell you an awful lot. It tells you that that sacral area is red. But if you add and non-blanching, we know that we've got a category 1 pressure ulcer there. We also know that it's in the sacrum, around the sacral area, so that we know the location, we know that it's red and non-blanching. So we know that we need to put something in place now to prevent that skin from breaking down any further. Turned 3 hourly. Why have you done that? So my rationale for this is, why have you repositioned them 2 hourly, 3 hourly, 4 hourly? What's your evidence for that? Care given, risk assessment reviewed. So just writing all care given doesn't give us a lot of information. But if you say care plan X, Y, and Z have been completed today, and all care has been given for those care plans, we know that we've got far more detail there of what has been done and what hasn't been done. Concerns? Discussed in handover. Who have you discussed it with? Have you needed to escalate anything? So just add a little bit more information. As I said, you do not need to write War and Peace. You need to write what is important and what you have done. And that brings us to the end of our documentation piece. So I'm just going to go to Sam before we start the Coroner's Court and just see if we have got any questions or any comments that she feels need to be shared.
So lots of questions about the recording. So I just want to clarify that after the event, a link will be available of the recording of this session for you to review. For a couple of you that were a bit later. So that link will be available, but it will be after the event. Had a really nice comment from somebody saying that they've also used the plus, and they won't do it again. So thank you for that. It was another comment just about mattress ordering, and they always make sure they put the order number and the date of delivery within the notes. Again, it's supporting that communication for your colleagues as well, so that then if it's not arrived, they've got the number to then be able to contact and know when it's to be able to chase that up. So yeah, good, brilliant. Right, we'll move on to the meeting the coroner in court.
So your role as the audience, you're going to play the role of the coroner at the end of this, and you're going to deliver what you think is the conclusion. And we will also ask you to deliver whether you feel a Regulation 28 is needed. So as I said at the beginning, there are going to be 5 short videos. Now, what you might find is that the lip sync may not marry up. Because there's so many of you on the call. However, it's not that important, because you just need to hear what's being said, and you will be able to hear it. It just might not sync with the lips very well. Okay. In between each video, what I'm going to do is ask you to put some comments in the chat. I know there's a lot of you on the call, so we won't be able to read everyone's comments, but Sam will be able to pick out a few, and we'll be able to have a bit of a conversation about it. At the end, you will play the coroner, as I said, and I'll ask you to put your conclusion in the chat and whether you feel that there needs to be any Regulation 28. And then at the end, if anyone has a burning desire to come on and speak to us and come off put the camera on, then please, by all means, you'll be very welcome to do that. I think I'm yet to have anybody come on and talk to us, but we can but try. So let's get started. And have I shared with, let's see if I've shared with sound. Just let Sam know in the chat if you can't hear it, okay?
I am resuming the inquest into the death of Elizabeth Black that was initially opened on the 3rd of April 2022. Have we got
any sound? Is anyone?
It is my duty today to listen to the evidence requested in order to assist me in answering 4 questions. Who the deceased is, when, where and how they came by their death. Who, when and where are usually straightforward.
I'm just going to pause. Has anyone put in the chat that they can hear it? They can. Brilliant. Let's carry on.
It is how they came by their death I need help with. I can confirm that the deceased's full name is Elizabeth Mary Black, but her family have expressed a wish for her to be referred to as Betty throughout this inquest. She was born on the 1st of January 1934 and died on the 31st of March 2022, whilst a resident in Boot Hill Residential Home. In order for me to be able to issue a death certificate, I need to establish the circumstances surrounding the death of Betty. I will gather the evidence, and based upon that, I will issue a death certificate. Under Rule 42, no verdict shall be framed in such a way as to appear to determine any question of criminal liability or civil liability. Based on the witness statements I have to date, I have taken the decision not to call a jury in this case. I may have to reverse that decision should evidence come to light which would suggest a jury is required. In order to help me today, I have called several witnesses to court and have legal representation for the hospital, for the residential home, and a brief statement from the family. It may be that I cannot actually conclude death due to natural causes, depending on contributing factors and the evidence heard during this inquest, in which case I will form a narrative version. We have heard from the pathologist, who has identified the cause of death as 1A, sepsis, secondary to 1B, infected sacral pressure ulcer with signs of osteomyelitis in the coccyx, 2A, heart failure. Following a fall, Betty was taken to the hospital and was assessed in the accident and emergency department, where she was found to have sustained a fractured femur. Could Miss Brown come to stand? Please, can you confirm your name and your current employment?
My name is Miss Brown, and I am the Deputy Director of Nursing, representing the A&E and orthopaedic wards.
When was Betty admitted, and what was she like?
Betty was first seen at the A&E department at 7:30 a.m. following a fall at her residential home during the night.
Was Betty triaged?
No, she had been brought in by ambulance.
Someone must have triaged or received a handover of Betty. How did the ambulance team hand over?
She was handed over to one of the night staff who triaged her. She was then put in reception on a trolley and was assessed by an A&E nurse at 9 a.m.
Why did she wait so long to see a doctor?
The department was very busy. The A&E nurses had numerous ward transfers, analgesia to administer, and overdue observations on 4 patients.
And what happened then?
She was heard to ask for help and was seen by a doctor who sent her for an X-ray, which showed she had a fractured hip.
And how long was she in X-ray?
Approximately 50 minutes, ma'am.
And how long was it in total before she went to the ward?
She waited 8 hours to be admitted to the orthopaedic ward.
Why did it take so long to admit Betty?
There had been an outbreak of norovirus, so some of the wards were closed and the remaining wards were full.
So Betty spent 8 hours in A&E. What was Betty laying on during that time?
An A&E trolley.
Was Betty given any pressure ulcer prevention during that time?
I'm not sure.
Why are you not sure?
I cannot find any records to confirm. I'm sure we tried to turn her, but she was in pain.
Was Betty offered any pain relief?
I will need to consult the notes. Nothing is documented here to say that she had any pain relief.
Can I confirm what you said? Betty was on a trolley without any pain relief for 8 hours.
According to the notes, yes.
Did anyone ring the family?
No. It was assumed that the residential home would have contacted them.
Do you not think it was important to ring the family?
Yes, but I can understand why, as the department was very busy that morning.
Please can I ask whether Mr. Park, the solicitor representing the hospital, would like to ask any questions?
Yes, thank you. Ms. Brown, is it correct that you were particularly busy that morning as you'd had 2 major road traffic accidents in the night before?
Yes, that's correct. Apart from the normal high volume of patients arriving at A&E, the department was still very busy due to the RTAs, which resulted in serious injuries and one death.
Okay, and since this has occurred, you've put extra procedures in place to help prevent this situation from happening again?
Yes, we now have charts on the wall for each patient detailing their specific needs, especially for pressure ulcer prevention. Also, the trolleys and mattresses have been changed to assist with pressure relief, and we now routinely turn all patients.
No more questions.
Thank you. Can I ask if Mr. Smith, representing the residential home, would like to address the witness?
Miss Brown, Were you aware that the residential home rang the family?
No, I wasn't aware. I just assumed they would, as it was one of their residents.
Were you aware the residential home sent a letter about Betty's medication?
Yes, it was in the notes.
Did you send a discharge letter back with her to the home?
Yes, as I said, all patients are sent home with discharge letters and copies posted to their GP.
Were you aware that when Betty came out, there was no discharge letter?
I wasn't aware.
This is not relevant at this time.
I agree.
Okay, so that's the end of our first video. So I want you to just pop in the chat your thoughts on what it is that you've just seen. Anything good, anything not so good that you have seen, and I'll ask Sam to let me know what everybody's saying. I'm sure she won't be able to keep up with everybody's opinions, but we'll be able to pick a couple of them out. So with regards to the legal team, Sam, what do you think the role of the legal team is?
So when they're doing their questioning, they're trying to highlight what the issues were. So obviously they said, oh my God, the chat's going mad now. They said about the neurovirus, the breakout of neurovirus, that they were very busy in the department. They had wards closed. So they're obviously just trying to illustrate where there was issues in that flow of patients when Betty first came into A&E. They also wanted to change that questioning to actually illustrate what they put, the interventions they put in place. So talking about the new charts they had to ensure that patients with pressure ulcers were regularly turned, and they're just illustrating and highlighting the new practices. It's about that lessons learned. You know, it's about that PSERF. It's something's gone wrong, and then what they've changed in their practice to stop it happening again to another patient.
Yeah. So the chat's gone mad, you said.
I'll just have a quick little read through and then I'll bring some bits out of it.
So one of the reasons as well that the legal team, it's their job to try and apportion, not the blame, because it's not a blame game, but put the responsibility with somebody else. And that is what the legal team for the care home was doing in asking about the discharge letter so early on. The hospital's legal team were very much focusing in on the fact that, as Sam said, the department was really busy. They'd had a road traffic collision in. There was problems with neurovirus within the hospital. So they're trying to say, you know, yes, something's gone wrong, but however, we're extremely busy and we're short of staff. However, what I ask you is shortness of staff and being busy an excuse for poor care? And I'm just going to go to Sam.
So I'm just going to go through. So quite a lot of no pain assessments.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Betty was on a trolley for 8 hours. She'd had no analgesia. Poor documentation and communication. And I think that's illustrated quite a few times, even from knowing who had contacted the family. They were assuming it was the nursing home. So again, lots of assumptions, poor documentation, quality of care with the no pain relief and assessment given. And you know, Betty was on an A&E trolley for 8 hours. I think even if I laid on an A&E trolley for 8 hours, I would most probably start getting some pressure damage, because they really aren't comfortable. I don't know if anyone's been on an A&E trolley, but not only that, with a fractured neck of femur and no analgesia.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot about the documentation. That's really good that you're picking up that the documentation just wasn't sufficient to be able to highlight the care that had been given or not given. Lots about saying we should never assume. Missed opportunities, gaps in documentation, basic interventions lacking. if nothing else, it makes us realise how vulnerable we are as nurses when we don't use appropriate documentation. And that's the thing, isn't it? We're all professionals. We sit on registered, if you're a registered nurse, and it's ensuring that we're protecting ourselves, like Charlie said earlier, and our patients. You know, we are vulnerable as nurses, but our patients are so vulnerable. Like, you know, a lot of the time, their lives are literally in our hands. And so we're in a very privileged position to be able to help people when they're really in need. And it can be extremely difficult. I'm not going to debate that. It can be. And I think it's getting more and more difficult. But you just have to keep the patient safe, and you need to make sure that you keep yourself safe, and your documentation will really help you to be able to do that, because that's your evidence. Another good comment, it's good that the hospital has identified their failings and have now put those new procedures in place. So again, it's about those lessons learned. No analgesia, no pressure care. Discharge summary is relevant when discharging from acute setting back to residential setting. Lots about the pain relief. Changes put in place now, which is good, but always has to be late. Pain meds. The staff were busy, probably unable to come up and give the patient their full extensive sort of care. Assumptions. Oh gosh, there was no analgesia. To establish what's happened, looking for obvious errors, issues could have been contributed to her death, highlighting the questions, the missed opportunity for documentation.
Brilliant.
Oh, you're very chatty, and that's brilliant. Keep it coming. I just have to spend a bit of time reading through it. I think we've highlighted the key points for this one. But also I'm just thinking now, if you are in a situation where you are working in an A&E department, you know, that needs to be escalated to your senior leaders, because what they can do, you know, there are processes that can be put in place where I know in my trust where I worked, we used to go to Oval, and then, you know, there was a facility to get ambulances deferred to other hospitals to ensure that you can sort of manage the flow. So again, it's doing that recording, it's doing that reporting to be able to effective the next level of support from your senior managers. So again, just remembering that there are processes in place to support you when you are, you know, we've all worked through COVID and we all had to work very differently, but it's that communication and ensuring that things are escalated, that you get the support needed.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all for being so interactive with us, because it makes this session so much better. I'm going to move on now to the next video, and then we'll do something very similar after that video.
I'd now like to look at what happened when Betty was transferred to the orthopaedic ward. When was Betty admitted?
3:30 p.m.
And when did she go to theatre?
5 p.m.
What did they do at theatre?
They repaired her fractured hip.
And were there any complications?
No, she came back to the ward and was quite well in herself.
Clearly there are no complaints about theatre. She had uncomplicated surgery and came back to the ward.
That's correct.
Any pressure ulcers when she came back to the ward? When did you start mobilising her?
Betty suffered with slight dementia, so the bed rails were up.
That's not the question I asked you. I asked, when did you start mobilising?
She wasn't mobilised until 4 days post-op.
Why not?
A physio assessment was required before she could be mobilised safely. However, the on-call physio team was running on skeleton staff and had several chest physio patients to deal with.
Did you get her out of bed at all?
No.
Did you do any pressure ulcer risk assessment before she went to theatre?
No.
Why not?
It wasn't time. By the time she arrived on the ward, she was prepped straight away for theatre.
Was there any assessment after surgery?
I will need to check the notes. No, it would appear not.
Why not?
I'm not sure. We must have forgotten.
Did you put her on any special mattress that might have helped prevent pressure ulcers from developing?
No.
Did you turn her?
Yes. When we washed Betty in the morning and changed her sheets, but not regularly until the Sunday, when we realised she wouldn't have a physio assessment until Tuesday.
Why not?
Each shift, we were expecting her to be assessed, to be mobilised. So we didn't implement a turning regime.
Did you or your team undertake a risk assessment on Betty at any time?
No, not until the pressure ulcer developed on day 4.
When was the pressure ulcer first noted?
We noticed that her bottom became red on the 4th day.
How did you treat the patient?
We applied a dressing to it as it was weeping onto her nightie and bedclothes.
Was it working?
Yes, the dressing appears to have managed the exudate and was changed every 2 days.
Did it deteriorate?
Yes, it did.
Did you reassess Betty?
She would have been reassessed at each dressing change.
When was she sent back to the care home?
She was sent back to the home on the 12th of March.
I have no further questions at this time. Mr. Park, do you wish to ask any further questions?
Yes, thank you. Let me summarize. Your department were extremely busy and short-staffed because of the norovirus. Betty went to theatre and experienced no complications. She didn't fall out of bed because the bed rails were up. And the family seemed very satisfied by their mother's care.
Yes. At no point was any complaint made regarding her care whilst on the ward.
No more questions at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, do you have any further questions?
I have no particular questions about her treatment, but was a discharge letter sent back with her to the home?
Yes, as I said, all patients are sent home with a discharge letter and copies posted to their GP.
So the care home did receive a discharge letter?
I would need to check the notes. It would appear that the letter was left behind and not given to Betty to take home. It is documented the discharge letter would be given to the ward clerk to put in the post.
Point out the discharge letter didn't arrive until 3 weeks later.
I don't know what happened with that.
Whilst I appreciate you were short of staff, the care home were also short of staff. Let me point out how residents don't get pressure ulcers.
This is not relevant at this time.
I agree.
It is quite clear she had a Category 4 pressure ulcer when she left the hospital and returned to the care home, where there was no discharge letter to advise the home of her current condition. Did you ask the district nurses to call?
An answer phone message was left for the district nurses to call at the residential home the next day.
What time was this done?
Approximately 4 p.m. on the day of discharge.
Did you send a letter to the district nurses telling them of her condition?
No. Usually the discharge letter would be passed on to them.
Did you ask the community tissue viability nurse to call?
No, I thought the district nurses would refer to tissue viability once they had assessed her.
No more questions at this time.
We now have a discharge process for all to follow.
Thank you, Mr. Park. Please don't interrupt. You'll have time to offer information prior to summing up on the case.
Okay, so have we seen anything better in that video? So some of the comments, so first of all, relating to the bed rails that they put up after Betty had had her theatre operation. If bed rails were up, did they consider a doles? What was Betty's capacity and understanding? Did they consider best interests? Did Betty understand the care being delivered at the restrictions in place? my safeguarding brain is going wild. So yeah, absolutely, all of those needed to be addressed and documented within the notes, to say what had happened in relation to that. Lack of documentation. It's not, it's going, every time I stop to read it, it moves on. Pressure damage risk should form part of the triage, especially knowing that the department is busy. Yeah, and they actually had an hour and a half from admission to ward to her going to surgery. So there was plenty of time to be able to do that assessment, but it didn't take place. There's a couple of bits that always shock me in this. So the lack of mobility after her surgery. So 4 days post-op before she was actually mobilised, because they didn't have enough physio staff over the weekend. Absolutely should have been doing a day text there. The lack of repositioning for this poor lady. So she was only repositioned in the morning when she had a wash and her sheets were changed. So for 24 hours at a time, she was left in the same position. I do hope that they were repositioning her when she needed to go to the toilet. And then they also said about, she had a red area. But they never said the skin was broken until they said it was then weeping, so they put a dressing on it. So that's what I mean when I say about your documentation. If you say an area is red, that just means that it's red. And that's where those 3 little words come in handy. If it's red and non-blanching, actually, we've got a category 1 pressure ulcer here. But if it's leaking, we know that's got to be at least a category 2 pressure ulcer, if not potentially a 3, because intact skin doesn't leak, does it? So she's got to have had a break in the skin for that skin to be able to leak. And that's why they then started putting those dressings on. About the Waterloo assessment. So again, I think it was day 4 when they actually found the pressure ulcer, the actual risk assessment was completed again. Policies in place is usually on that first contact, a risk assessment should be completed. And obviously lots of missed opportunities in many different departments, because she was in an A&E, she was in theatre, she was admitted to a ward. So lots of opportunities missed. Delayed in being seen by the physiotherapy staff, like you said, 4 days, that should have been escalated. If she was supposed to see them on that first day and it wasn't done, again, it's that escalation. It's highlighting where that failings happened within the team, so that then people can take action. Not clear if duty of candour was undertaken, because obviously she had sustained damage within that hospital stay. Was duty of candour completed? Serious training issues in the department. Was the family aware of the pressure ulcers or the failings? And then someone said about an answer phone message. I think we are a lot more IT proficient within the NHS, so there is a lot more IT referrals rather than answer phone messages and things like that happening, because things get missed, things get lost in translation. So again, it's how things have developed to ensure that we've learned from the lessons that have happened in the past. Delays in post-op mobilisation. Someone's put just shocking. Always leave to district nurses to refer on, sadly. So again, saying about they assumed that the TVN referral would be done in community. No assessments until day 4. Staff could have phoned and handed over what was on the discharge letter. Poor communication, poor documentation.
Absolutely.
Full risk assessment missing. So yeah, you've picked out a lot. Poor documentation, MCA, capacity, rails, unsafe. The devil's in the detail. I like that. They could have repositioned her regularly. And that deconditioning, absolutely. You know, Betty she was mobile before she went in. She's now had 4 days and an operation and not been mobilized. So think of all that muscle wastage that will have happened for her.
Yeah.
And this sometimes happens, doesn't it? Someone goes into hospital for an acute reason, and then they come out and all of a sudden they've lost that mobility.
Yeah. And it happens more often than you think as well.
Someone's put usually hips get up the next day.
Yeah.
Why did Ortho Ward not have their own physio? Brilliant. Loads of
picking out some really key points in what you're hearing, which is absolutely brilliant. I'm just going to touch on the solicitors again. So again, the hospital solicitor is trying to paint the hospital in a good light, saying that the family was satisfied with the care, that she didn't fall out of her bed because the bed rails were up, and that her surgery went really well, that the departments were busy and short-staffed because of the neurovirus. And then again, the nursing home asking about the discharge letter and that it hadn't been received for 3 weeks, around the phone message left with the district nurses and whether there would be a discharge letter passed on to those district nurses, which we know that wouldn't happen, would it? Because it didn't come home with the patient. But then the hospital solicitor also interrupted and said that that discharge process was now in situ. And I would like to think that discharge processes have improved, and I can hear you all chuckling on this subject, because a lot of trusts now do have discharge teams, they have discharge coordinators, transfer of care teams. So the communication should be much better. With regards to what Sam said about, you know, the telephone message left for the district nurses, quite a lot of places now have like a single point of access referral. So you have to ring and you give a referral to a person. And it's actually quite a lengthy referral that you have to give to enable them to then pass that on to the right person. And so those referrals shouldn't be slipping through the net quite as often. Now, I know you can all see that there's a picture on this screen. And if you remember, when we went through the categories of pressure ulcer, according to the National Wound Care Strategy Programme, we no longer have a category for deep tissue injury, which I'm hoping you can all see on these pictures, on this picture that is on the screen. But this is a really good picture to be able to discuss around when you're doing your wound assessment, because there are multiple areas on both of the feet here that have clearly got problems with pressure damage. So we can see there is deep tissue injuries. We can see that there's areas of redness. We would need to know, wouldn't we, if those areas of redness are blanching or non-blanching, because that would tell us whether we've got a category 1 or if we didn't have a category 1. And also help you to decide what's the best next steps for this patient. So I'm not going to ask you all to categorize this, because in some areas this will still be a category, in some areas it won't. But it is quite good at highlighting the fact that you need to state the location. There's multiple locations on this person's feet, both feet. So you'd need to be very specific about where that damage is and what damage it is that you are seeing. Okay. So we're going to go on now to the next video, and then we'll have a similar discussion again.
Can Mr. White come to the stand? Can you confirm your name and your current employment?
I'm Mr. White, and I'm the manager of the residential home.
You are one of the senior nurses?
No, I'm the manager, but not a registered nurse.
How long have you worked there?
For approximately 10 years.
You know your residents well?
Oh, yes. I work predominantly days, so I get to spend a great deal of time with all my residents.
Now, can I first of all ask you to run through Betty's situation?
Yes, Betty was found on the floor during the night between the commode and the bed.
Did Betty have bed rails up?
No, Betty was quite independent with her frame and could get out of bed herself. She had been doing this for the past 5 years. Her family knew that she could quite safely potter around the home and would have her buzzer if she wanted us.
And is it correct that she was found at 6:15 a.m. in the morning?
Yes.
Can't hear quite
One of the
hear
carers
properly.
found her whilst doing
Sounds-
his hourly rounds.
When was she
seems
last
a bit
seen?
to be
According to the
It's
carer,
lagging sound properly.
he went round at 4 a.m. and looked in on Betty, who was fast asleep in bed.
Did Betty normally go to the toilet during the night?
Yes.
Start again.
She had her buzzer, but would
now.
normally use
Sound
the
issue
commode herself
sound keeps breaking
and
up.
would only ring
Seems
the
okay
buzzer
now,
if
so
she wanted a
better.
cup of tea.
Had she rung?
So I think some people are having some sound issues. That could be related to your internet speed. So I'm just going to start this video again, just for those that have missed some of it, so that everyone can hear it.
Thank you.
Can Mr. White come to the stand? Can you confirm your name and your current employment?
I'm Mr. White, and I'm the manager of the residential home.
You are one of the senior nurses?
No, I'm the manager, but not a registered nurse.
How long have you worked there?
For approximately 10 years.
You know your residents well?
Oh, yes. I work predominantly days, so I get to spend a great deal of time with all my residents.
Now, can I first of all ask you to run through Betty's situation?
Yes, Betty was found on the floor during the night between the commode and the bed.
Did Betty have bed rails up?
No, Betty was quite independent with her frame and could get out of bed herself. She had been doing this for the past 5 years. Her family knew that she could quite safely potter around the home and would have her buzzer if she wanted us.
And is it correct that she was found at 6:15 a.m. in the morning?
Yes. One of the carers found her whilst doing his hourly rounds.
When was she last seen?
According to the carer, he went round at 4 a.m. and looked in on Betty, who was fast asleep in bed.
Did Betty normally go to the toilet during the night?
Yes. She had her buzzer, but would normally use her commode herself and would only ring the buzzer if she wanted a cup of tea.
Had she rung the buzzer that particular evening?
No, on this particular evening, she had slept very well.
And did you hear any noise at all?
No, nothing. The carer just popped his head in that morning to check on her, as he would normally do.
And what did he find?
He found Betty on the floor between the commode and the bed. She didn't have a Zimmer frame with her this time.
Was Betty able to tell you what had happened?
Not really. She was, well, how shall I say? She was a happy but confused lady. She said she'd fallen, but the carer said she'd wet herself, so we assumed that she'd fallen trying to get to her commode.
And what did the carer do?
He pressed the emergency buzzer and called the senior carer on duty, who decided to call an ambulance as Betty's leg appeared to be shortened. She also appeared to be in a lot of pain, so the carers didn't want to move her.
And Betty was taken to hospital?
Yes, the paramedics arrived, gave her some pain relief, and took her to hospital.
And how long did it take?
They came within 20 minutes. Paramedic arrived initially, followed by a 2-man ambulance crew. They made her as comfortable as possible and then took Betty to hospital.
Okay, so I can see Sam scrolling, so I think there's lots of messages in the chat already. So any that you want to share, Sam?
Yeah, so picked up really quickly on if there were hourly rounds and checks in the why was she last seen at 4 but then found on the floor at 6:15.
Absolutely.
So there was a 2-hour gap. And that also means that she potentially was laying on the floor for 2 hours. And if you think about her journey throughout, you know, she's now got 2 hours of laying on the floor, 8 hours on a hospital trolley, then into a theatre.
Yeah.
It all sort of adds up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
She had dementia. Shouldn't assume that she would ring for assistance. Maybe looking at the sensory maps you can get. Where was her simmer frame? Exactly, you know, she may have actually, this all started because she couldn't reach her frame.
Yeah.
Confused and incontinent. So not only was she laying on the floor for potentially 2 hours, she could have been laying in urine as well. Paramedics gave some analgesia. So again, that documentation, was she safe still to potter around on the frame if she was confused? Restricted practice in hospital, not necessary. Care home didn't share information. Betty confused. Sounds like care home didn't complete risk assessment. Analgesia would have been handed over from when she was brought in by ambulance.
Yeah.
And that, this one says, did the home send hospital passport? So I'm not aware of a hospital passport, but I'm assuming that's a form of communication between different services. Should have had falls equipment, falls risk. Should a carer from the home have gone to the hospital with her? So I don't know if that's a common practice. I haven't seen it in my career as such as a common. I know if you've got sort of 24-hour carers, they often came with patients to the hospital. But I think in care homes, again, staffing wise, they've got to have a minimum amount of staff available and to have that staff member to be able to leave. There's lots of assumptions made.
Far too many assumptions throughout this whole process, particularly where the family are involved. You know, the hospital assumed the care home would contact the family. We don't know that the family were even aware that she developed a pressure ulcer. But who is responsible for contacting the family? All of us. Whoever's care she is in. So actually, the care home should have contacted the family to say that she'd had a fall and was going into hospital. The hospital should have contacted the family to say that they'd received her, what the problem was, and what potentially the plan was. And I appreciate that we can't give an awful lot of information over the telephone. But that should have been a continuous process. It shouldn't have just been one agency or another that was contacting the family. They needed to keep them up to date, and the family were, you know, needed to know how to be able to contact the ward, etc., as to where their mum was. So
yeah, lots of agreements with you there, Charlie. Yeah. Everyone should have contacted the family. Everyone is responsible to inform next of kin. Better too many calls than none at all.
Exactly. Brilliant. So I'm pleased you picked up about the hourly rounds that was done during the night, because that's always the first thing that I pick up from that video, and then around, you know, whereabouts she hadn't rung the buzzer, but he said she usually does. So was the buzzer actually in a place that she could reach? Was her frame in a place that she could reach? Had the commode been put where it usually is put, or had it been put somewhere else? Were the brakes on the commode? And actually she was able to get to the commode, but the brakes hadn't been put on it, and that's why she fell. So, and we don't know, do we? Because there's nothing documented about any of that, to be able to say where any of it was placed. Right, brilliant. We're going to go on to the next video now.
Now, I want to talk to you about when Betty came out of hospital. What was she like when she came back to the home?
She wasn't mobilizing, so we had to hoist her onto the bed, and she had a dressing on her bottom that was dirty and soiled in places.
Did you receive a discharge letter?
No, there was no discharge letter. I contacted the hospital ward to get information.
Was she sent home with any medication? Was there any information regarding this from the hospital?
No, nothing. After speaking to the hospital, we found out that she was on the same medication she was on prior to her admission. So we had everything here.
So Betty just arrived in an ambulance from the hospital.
Yes.
As you had no information, what did you do?
We rang the district nurses, who said it would be Wednesday or Thursday before somebody could visit to assess Betty, as they had no availability for extra visits.
Did you tell them how bad the ulcer was on Betty's bottom?
No, at this stage, all we knew was that she had a dressing on her bottom that needed assessing and changing. We are only a residential home, so we can't do those things.
How did you cope with Betty's needs?
With difficulty. We're not qualified nurses. We are a care home who rely on the local district nurses for nursing support. We didn't have all the relevant equipment ready for Betty when they sent her home.
What did you do?
Betty needed nursing care. So I rang the district nurses again. We couldn't wait. We didn't have any dressings available, and Betty's dressing really needed changing.
Did you speak with anyone?
I left an answer machine message. The district nurse did phone back the following day. But in the meantime, we put her back on her own medication and put on a dressing from another resident, as we had to make her clean and comfortable. We also gave her a good wash, as she looked dirty, and cut her fingernails, which had grown so long and were dirty underneath. What Betty liked best of all was a good cup of tea. She was so thrilled to see us, as we were faces that she knew. She was a lovely lady, and we loved talking to her. A bit confused at times, but we loved having her around.
What happened with Betty over the next few days?
The district nurse called to see her and was appalled at the state she was in. She'd never seen anything like it and didn't know how the hospital could send her out like that. We are only a care home, but we were just left to cope. The GP also called after 2 days and prescribed some antibiotics. The district nurse changed the dressing, but poor Betty was so poorly she just went downhill.
What do you mean she went downhill?
She seemed to lose the will to live, stopped eating, would still drink, but she lost her spark. Betty's wounds started to smell, which upset her, and she wasn't able to get in and out of bed herself, and would ring the bell if she needed the toilet, but would sometimes soil herself before we got there. It was painful for Betty to move and sit up in bed due to the pressure ulcer, and then she developed a chesty cough, so we rang the GP. She begged us and the GP not to send her back to that hospital. And John, her son, asked if we would keep her at the home and care for her there. Although we're only a care home, we couldn't send her back to that hospital. Sadly, Betty died a few days later. We cared for her, and we were with her when she passed on. She seemed to be at peace.
I have no further questions at this time. Can I ask Mr. Park, representing the hospital, if he has any questions?
Okay, so it's the end of part 4.
So we've got lots of things about how they actually got her into the nursing home, hoisting her, who did an assessment to say she was appropriate to be hoisted, should she have gone back to a residential home with a query category 4 pressure ulcer. And this was a comment. As a district nurse myself, often if no one else has the answer, it comes to the district nurse every time. Answer phone again. Did the care home not assess Betty prior to discharge from hospital? And like you said earlier about the discharge teams transferring patients out, that there are more effective teams now in place that would be able to review this prior to her going out of hospital. Resident shouldn't be using other residents' dressings, cutting nails. They should have arranged equipment prior to discharge. Failed discharge, poor discharge, any social worker involvement.
And I think that's from my experience, if we have had a care home resident or even a nursing home resident, generally the manager comes back in to reassess that patient before they're discharged to ensure that they are able to take that resident back and be able to manage the needs of that patient. But I think because the hospital didn't give them very much information other than that she was fit for discharge and could come home, perhaps the care home there should have pushed back and said, actually, we'd like to come and review her ourselves and just do our own assessment before we accept her back.
It's also the learning from the hospital staff. You know, maybe they assumed that a residential home had nursing staff as well, and assuming that she's going into a nursing environment, without understanding the care that's provided at different settings. Failed discharge. Did the district nurse ask TVN to review the pressure ulcer? Could they have contacted social services? Did she have capacity to refuse the return to hospital? No discharge letter. Failed by the whole system. Unsafe discharge. Care home should still have taken her back to hospital. It would be their duty of care unless Betty had capacity to make that choice. And apparently she had dementia.
There may have been, so I delivered this the other day and we had a really good discussion around that and the fact that the family and Betty and the carers didn't feel that, you know, she didn't want to go back to hospital and they didn't want to send her back there either. But who has got the power to make that decision? Did the family have power of attorney over her health and well-being? Could they make that decision? Was the GP involved with that decision? Because actually in her best interests, potentially, you know, some IV antibiotics might have meant we got on top of that infection, stopped that sepsis, and she may not have passed away. But she may have done a previous respect form when she did have capacity that may have stated that she didn't want to go back into hospital if this was a scenario potentially, or the GP could have made that decision in her best interests, but we don't know if the GP was involved in those conversations.
Brilliant. Also, someone's put safeguard. It's a Cat 4 again. These escalations, these reports just weren't completed. So yeah, brilliant.
Fab. Some brilliant comments there. So we're going on to our last video now, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about that video afterwards. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to get you to be the coroner and decide on what your conclusion and your verdict is. So let's start the next video.
Thank you, Mum. Betty had a fall at your home, did she not?
Yes, she had a fall, tried to get to her commode.
Did she not need nursing care to help her to the toilet?
No, for the last 5 years, she had been going to the toilet independently and would only use the commode at night, so she didn't have to walk too far soon after waking. All of our residents have quarterly risk assessments as standard, unless their needs change drastically in that time.
The nurse on the ward rang your home and you said you were prepared to accept Betty back.
But she didn't tell us that she had a huge pressure ulcer. She didn't tell us that she'd lost her mobility. She just said that she'd had her surgery, was fit for discharge, and asked if we were prepared to accept her back. We always take our residents back.
No more questions.
Mr. Smith, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you. Can I just make it clear there was no discharge letter?
No, there wasn't.
Called the district nurses?
Yes, 2 or 3 times.
Called the GP?
Yes, with the district nurses when they visited due to their concerns.
Can you just explain to the learned coroner what type of patients you take?
We are a residential home, and all of our residents are assessed prior to coming in on their ability to perform normal activities. Most of our residents can mobilize with a frame or at least transfer themselves. We have one or two who require a hoist, but as long as they don't have nursing needs, we can accept them. If they do need nursing care, we work in partnership with the district nurses, and as long as they are happy and can support, we are also happy.
Do you have any qualified nurses?
No, sir, we do not.
No more questions.
Thank you, Mr. White. I now have a short statement to read from the family. John and the rest of the family would like to express their gratitude to all at Boot Hill Residential Home for all they did for his mother, Betty. They were very pleased you were able to keep her there and care for her, surrounded by people she knew and trusted in her last few weeks of life. Can I now ask Nurse Spears to come to the stand? Can you please confirm your name and current employment?
I'm Nurse Spears, a district nurse.
Have you been to Boot Hill Residential Home before?
Yes. We visit twice a week to provide a service for patients that require nursing care, such as catheter maintenance, insulin injections, change leg ulcer dressings.
Did you get notification from the hospital about Betty?
Yes. A message was left on our answer machine informing us that Betty had been discharged.
What information were you given?
Just that Betty had been discharged and that we would need to assess her.
Did the residential home ring you?
Yes, one of the carers left a message for us asking for urgent help.
Then why did you say you'd go in 2 to 3 days?
The care home didn't indicate why it was urgent on the phone, nor did we receive an urgent referral from them.
Did you get a second phone call?
Yes.
What did you find when you got to the home?
I was so shocked. I haven't seen anything like it for years. It was a huge sacral pressure ulcer. You could see the bone.
How would you grade it?
Category 4. We call them categories now.
Was the wound infected?
Yes. It was showing all the clinical signs of infection. We spoke to the GP who visited and said she needed antibiotics.
Think she was fit to come back to the residential home?
Not at all.
Why not?
Betty would have been fine to have been discharged with the appropriate discharge plan in place. That would have given everyone enough time to have provided the appropriate resources, such as mattresses, appropriate dressings, and support for the home so that Betty could be safely discharged back into their care.
Why did you not readmit her?
I cannot admit someone to hospital. I have to do that via the GP. The family and Betty didn't want her to go back into hospital, though. They were adamant. The residential home were happy to keep her with our support.
Did you arrange for some dressings?
Yes.
And who was going to change them?
One of our district nursing team was to call every day.
They call every day? Did you not hear my question?
Unfortunately, no. The district nurse did not call every day.
Why not?
Well, one weekend, I left a message on the handover phone for the weekend team to visit, but no one picked it up, so she didn't get a visit on that Saturday.
Did Betty's pressure ulcer start to heal?
No.
Why do you think it didn't get any better?
It was so bad when she came back to the home. Due to her reduced mobility, she had grown incontinent. Her skin was so delicate, and her general condition deteriorated very rapidly.
This is a residential home?
Yes.
Did you arrange for a pressure-relieving mattress?
We advised regular turning initially.
That was not the question I asked you.
It was on order.
Did it arrive?
Not before she died.
Who should have ordered this so that it would have been there in time?
If the hospital had given us enough notice, we could have had all of this in place ready for discharge.
Did you receive a discharge letter?
No. It actually arrived 2 weeks after Betty had died.
Was a referral made to anyone else?
No.
Why not?
I would have expected the hospital to have done that.
But surely, as a district nurse, wouldn't you request it?
Well, no. The hospital requests the district nursing team to visit. I would have requested them to have asked for the TVN referral if I I had been aware of the situation.
Thank you. Mr. Park, do you have any questions for the witness?
Yes, thank you. When did you receive the hospital message about Betty's discharge?
As it was after 4 p.m, we didn't pick it up until the following morning. It didn't mention that Betty was ill or that she needed an urgent visit, just that she had been discharged from the ward and that we would need to make an assessment.
Do you see many pressure ulcers in the community?
We see a few pressure ulcers from time to time, but over the years that has greatly improved through education and training, especially in residential and nursing homes.
Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, do you have any further questions?
Yes, thank you. Can I clarify that the residential home rang you and asked for an urgent visit and it was your decision not to do so?
Yes.
Can I also clarify that you called the GP and that he had already been called by the residential home?
Yes.
Can I clarify that you did not receive the discharge letter, nor did the residential home?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's the final video. And I think you can probably pick some faults out there as well. I think Sam's just looking at some of the comments that are coming through.
All aspects of care were failed for this poor lady. Do we know that it was actually hospital acquired? There's no evidence to say it was not on arrival, because again, there was no skin checks or any documentation prior to that. It goes back to the if not documented, then not done, no record of skin inspection. The care home blamed the hospital for not handing over the pressure ulcer, but surely the SBAR worked two ways and they should ask about skin and pressure areas and mobility. Quarterly risk assessments not enough. No frequent risk assessments. Faults on both sides, hospital and the residential home. An assessment should have been completed upon accepting her back to the home. A few laughs about the insulin injections twice a week. Get that every single time.
If only, hey, if only.
Assessed for what? Poor communication. Did you ask what was needed? Poor communication. Poor triage. Surely the care home should have asked more questions about Betty's level of care following her surgery. I think the DN has just nailed it on the head. Did the DN discuss sepsis with family, home and Betty? Poor discharge planning.
Yeah.
Regular turning, how often?
And she had a category 4 pressure ulcer, and initially all they recommended was repositioning, no mattress or anything else.
Yeah. Was there a discussion about catheterizing Betty? Poor discharge, lots of assumptions, must score, nutritional assessment, referral to dietitian. What about poor safeguarding this poor woman? Review of incontinence, learning from all omissions, lack of communication. Loads of comments. You've all really, really great comments. Thank you, everybody, because we need those to make the session really interactive. So really, really good. Lack of advocacy. Should never have been discharged back to the residential home.
No, absolutely. And I agree with all of your comments. And it all comes back to, doesn't it, right care for the right for the right patient at the right time by the right person. Was the care given to this lady by the right people? Evidently not. Sadly. And sadly, you know, these are cases that are happening all of the time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to you guys. I'm going to change the slide over, and I just want you to decide on what you think the conclusion is for this case. And if you could give a little reason as to why you think it's that. So I'm just going to change these are your findings, your verdict, your conclusion. So if you could decide on which one of these you think is the conclusion, and just a little reason as to why, because poor Sam won't be able to keep up with everybody's, but I'm sure lots of you will all be saying the same things. So if you could decide on what your conclusion is, give you a couple of minutes, and then we'll start having a little look through. And the other aspect to think about is whether you think there should be a regulation 28. So I'm just going to change the slide. I will change it back, don't worry. But is a regulation 28 needed? And if so, which company, trust, institution do you think needed to have a regulation 28? And just a little reason as to why for that as well, please. That would be great. So I'll flick between these two slides just so that you can read both and make your decision, and that will be great. And then we'll have another little conversation about those, and then I'll tell you what the conclusion was. Some answers started coming through.
Got lots and lots of neglect as a conclusion. A couple of narratives. Yes, agree for 28 is required. A regulation 28 for the hospital and care home transfer information. Regulation 28 to the hospital have failing to commence their neglect from the care home, ED, the ward and the district nurses at every part of her journey. The care could have resulted in a different outcome, sadly. Neglect from hospital care team, community team, and yes, yeah, regulation 28. Still loads of neglects coming through as a conclusion. Someone's put narrative as well. So we're getting occasional narratives, but the large proportion is neglect.
Yeah.
Nobody said that they shouldn't have a regulation 28 yet.
Okay.
So it's all so the majority is for a neglect as a conclusion, and a regulation 28 required. Most people are saying either from the acute trust, but also acute trust DNs and the care home.
Yeah.
Because there's so many lessons to be learned, isn't there?
Absolutely.
It is across the board.
Okay. So shall I give you the conclusion? So the conclusion is a narrative here, and I completely understand why lots and lots of you are saying neglect. And often when myself and the rest of the team deliver this in face-to-face scenarios, neglect often comes up. And the reason that it isn't a neglect is because it wasn't a gross failure to provide the deceased with basic needs. So basic needs were met. There wasn't a gross failure in providing those, although some people would argue that. So it is a narrative conclusion that the coroner found with this case. And actually with the regulation 28, there wasn't a regulation 28 filed for any of the areas here, because the hospital were very good at negating that throughout the hearing and saying what they'd actually put in place throughout to prevent this from happening again. There are absolutely lessons learned for the hospital, for the care home and for the district nurses. Lots of assumptions that were made that should not have been made. And we can't ever assume anything. We need to go off facts. And we need to make sure that we have documented those facts to be able to, if you get called into a coroner's court, to recall those. And that will help you to explain the decisions that you made and why, along with the documentation that you have made. So we're coming towards the end of the Coroner's Court today. And I have to say a massive, massive thank you to all of you for being so interactive with us on the chat. Poor Sam hasn't been able to keep up with all of your comments, but we will go back and read through them all. And thank you for taking time out of your day to join this Coroner's Court. As Sam said earlier, there will be a recording of this Coroner's Court available afterwards, which will get sent to you. But what I do need you to do is scan this QR code for us and fill out this evaluation form. This will enable you to be able to get your certificate to say that you've attended, and you can use this for your CPD. There's a QR code, and if anyone is struggling with the QR code, I can put the link in the chat to be able to for you to be able to complete it off the link. So if you could all fill that out for me, we would really appreciate it. If anyone wants to come on camera and wants to share any of their thoughts about today's session or what they have heard, this isn't a real case. However, there are bits taken from multiple real cases, and actually, sadly and surprisingly, these types of cases do happen. And so it's, although it's not a real case, there will be a Betty out there somewhere, and probably several of her as well. So I'm going to be quiet for a minute so you can carry on with your evaluation forms. A couple of other things I will just tell you about. We do have a website, so Coloplast Professional is our website. You can find more information about further webinars that we will be doing there. We will be doing them monthly from January, not just Coroners Courts, but lots of other topics: wound infection, wound preparation. We will talk more, a little bit more about the Coloplast products in those sessions. We do have a publication out with Wounds UK around the Coloplast 3-step approach of assess, prepare and treat, which is a simple framework to help you with wound healing. It's around holistic assessment, wound preparation using All Prep Pad, and then treatment using the Biotane 3D Fit technology range. That perfect marriage of Biotane, silicone and All Prep Pad to help you really start to move those wounds into healing phases. We also have Sam and I have a podcast that we have done for Coloplast. It's called Wound Care Conversations, and you can find that on any of your podcasting sites. It's available on all of them, so please do have a listen. But if anyone wants to come on and speak to us, then please just pop your hand up and we can unmute your mic and you can have a chat. Does anybody still need the QR code and the link? If not, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Oh, I think someone's trying to talk.
What's the podcast called again, please?
It's Wound Care Conversations.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're getting loads of well dones and thank yous, Charlie. Lots of people have taken lots from today. Really helpful. Great session. Be advising my colleagues to attend. Thank you. So yeah, pleased you've all got something from today's session.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make this session, you really do, by being interactive with us, because if you're not, it's it can be quite difficult, because obviously Sam and I can give our experiences, but it's always really good to hear the experiences of multiple different healthcare professionals across multiple different backgrounds.
I think Sandra's got her hand up to ask a question.
Yeah,
Sandra. Oh, is it not Sandra?
Hi, I think Kate was before me, actually.
Oh, okay. Kate.
Hi, is this okay to share the link once we receive it to our team? I am the tissue viability link nurse in our unit.
Yeah, so once you've completed your evaluation form, you'll get an email from Coloplast Professionals with the link for the recording.
Sure. Okay, so it's okay to share with our teams?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's very informative. Thank you so much.
you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I think was it Sandra?
Hi, yeah.
Hi.
Just
Kate's just answered my question really well about the link afterwards and sharing with the rest of the team. But thank you, it was really informative and certainly makes you think about your practice.
It does, doesn't it? Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing my page. If anyone needs the link, I'm just going to pop it in the chat. If anyone's not managed to scan the QR code.
I think we've got another question. Catherine, do you want to come on and ask a question?
Yeah, thank you so much for the session. I'm a plastics and burns nurse based up in Tayside within Scotland.
No.
For ordering like the equipment and that, just so I can speak to my senior nurse, is this an England only sort of, can we only get the stuff, is it England only, or can we get stuff in Scotland as well? Because I know sometimes the health boards work differently.
What sort of stuff are you talking about?
So just like any wound care stuff, because we do get so because we're a plastics ward, we do get patients in either from care homes or out in the community with pressure ulcers that have to get debrided and sometimes skin grafted. So it's just whether if there was any equipment, is it like, are we able to order it in Scotland?
You should be able to.
Things aren't available to us.
Yeah, you should be able to get my teeth in. Order equipment for the patients, but dressings as well. I do know that biotin silicone is on the Scottish formulary, as is Prep, but whether it's on your local formulary, that's another question. But yeah, you should absolutely be able to order equipment for the patients.
If you're in a burns and plastics ward, did you say you're in a ward?
Yeah,
discharge out. Yeah, so if you speak to your equipment stores, they'll be able to advise you, because there's lots of different companies that support and supply to trusts. So you just need to find someone from your equipment stores area, and they'll be able to advise you how to get the equipment and support you with that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share this this link with my senior nurse, because I think it'd be quite good for some of my colleagues to do this as well, because it's quite relevant to us, some of the stuff that with what we see on the ward.
Absolutely.
I think, is it Maria? Maria, do you want to come off and ask a question?
Can you see me? I've just lost myself. Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that I'm not a nurse. I used to work as a nurse, but I'm training staff now, and I thought the documentation side of thing was really quite good, and I think I will be able to use some of that in my training.
Brilliant.
I mean, you can't emphasize them anymore. You know, if you don't write it down, it doesn't happen. You try, but people don't listen.
Yeah.
So thank you for this.
Brilliant.
This has been a very good session. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We've got a few questions just coming in on the chat around the presentation. Once the webinar is finished, you will get an email from Coloplast Professional with a link to watch the webinar again. And if you filled out the QR code or the link, which I'm struggling to put in the chat at the moment, but I will continue to try, then you will also get sent through a certificate. It won't be immediately. There are lots of you on here, so it might take a few days for it to come through. If you don't receive anything, oh, there we go. Somebody's put the webinar evaluation in. Thank you. If you don't hear anything in a few days to a week, then do just send us an email at Coloplast Wound and Skin Care, and we can get you one sent over. Okay. You're all very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm oh, Catherine, you've got your hand up. Sorry.
I think you've already spoken to
Catherine.
Have we?
Yeah. Okay.
I think Ali, have you got a question?
Not a question. I just want to say thank you very much for the information. It was very relevant.
You're very welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you all for taking time out of your day. I hope that it has been a useful session for you, and it will make you think. Remember, you don't need to write reams and reams, just the important stuff. but do think about it when you're doing your documentation. Would this help me in a coroner's court? And I think that will help you to write better notes and documentation. So thank you all for joining, and I hope we see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.